meeting of the Lincoln-Lancaster County Planning Commission of September 30th, 2020. A printed agenda is available outside the hearing room, and a copy of the full agenda, including the staff reports, is available at the front of the chambers with the clerk. The Open Meetings Act is posted just inside the doors at the back of the room. In order to meet the required social distancing protocols, we must limit the number of people inside the chambers. Staff is assisting individuals who are present and wish to testify on items on today's agenda by ensuring that each person has signed in. Staff will direct you into the chambers based on what items you are testifying on or your position on that item. We are requiring attendees in the chambers to sit in a socially distanced manner 6 feet apart from other people not in your immediate group. If there are more than 25 people attending for a particular agenda item, staff will bring additional attendees into the chamber as people testify and then leave the chambers. Once you have testified, you should exit the chambers using the doors to the right of the desk, and then the next testifier can come up to the microphone and begin testifying. For the protection of all those involved, the Planning Commission will also be allowing testimony on agenda items by video conferencing. For those who are registered prior to this hearing, your testimony will be taken once all live testimony has concluded. Based on estimations, we are staggering the times of various hearings over several hours. These times are identified in parentheses on the agenda. We are encouraging attendees to arrive no more than 15 minutes before their scheduled hearing. Please note that an agenda item will not begin before the time posted. In the event that the allocated hearing times go quicker than estimated, there will be breaks in the hearing. If you parked in the garage across the street to the north, the gate is open and no parking coupons are necessary. Out of courtesy for those attending this meeting, the commissioners and the staff, cellular phone usage is not permitted in these chambers during any portion of this meeting. We appreciate your cooperation. The Planning Commission action today is final on the following agenda items. 1.1, Comprehensive Plan Conformance 20013. 1.3b, Preliminary Plat 20004. 1.4, Special Permit 20035. 1.5, Special Permit 20036. And 1.7, Use Permit 19001A. Any aggrieved person may appeal final action of the Planning Commission to the City Council or the County Board by filing a notice of appeal with the clerk within 14 days following the action of the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission action on all other items is a recommendation to the City Council or County Board. The first item of business is the approval of the minutes of the regular meeting held September 16th, 2020.
Move to approve.
Second, Finnegan.
Jerry?
Campbell,
Yes.
Finnegan,
Yes.
Joy,
Yes.
Ryman Yost,
Yes.
Beckius,
Yes.
Core.
Yes.
Motion carried 6-0.
The next item of business is the consent agenda. Items on the consent agenda will be called at the same time and will not be scheduled for a separate public hearing unless there is a request from someone wishing to speak or at the request of a commission member. I will ask Jerry to read all of the consent agenda items into the record. Once those items are read, she will ask if there is anyone wishing to speak. If you wish to speak on an item on the consent agenda, we would ask that you stand and state that item. That item will then be removed from the consent agenda and scheduled as a separate public hearing under Section 3 of today's agenda. All items remaining on the consent agenda will be voted upon in total with a motion for approval. Jerry, will you please call the items on the consent agenda?
Yes, before I do that, I'd like to note that Commissioner Scheer, although he's absent today, has declared a conflict of interest on items 1.6, which is use permit 132D, and item 1.7, use permit 19001A. Also, I would note that on today's consent agenda, we'll be removing 3 items prior to acting on the consent agenda. These items will have separate action. Item 1.2 is the comprehensive conformance or plan conformance 20014 relating to the terminal building redevelopment project. Item 1.3 is change of zone 20029 and the associated item, which is item 1.3b, preliminary plat 2004. So those will have separate action. I will not read those into the record. Item 1.1 is comprehensive plan conformance 20013 to review as to conformance with the 2040 Lincoln Lancaster County Comprehensive Plan to amend the City of Lincoln's 6-year capital improvement program for fiscal year 2020 to 2026 by adding the expansion of an existing Lincoln Electric System Rokeby Generating Station Operations Center on property generally located at 8,000 Southwest 12th Street. This is final action on this item, and staff recommendation on this is a conformity to the comp plan. Item 1.4 is special permit 20035 to allow for the sale of alcohol for consumption both on and off the premises for King's Crossing Condominium, Amended Unit 7 on property generally located at 2741 King Lane. Item 1.15, special permit 20036 to allow for a veterinary facility on property generally located at 100 Mckelvey Road. And this is final action on both of those special permits unless appealed to the City Council. Item 1.6 is use permit 132D for an adjustment to the maximum height to 100 feet for a flagpole on property generally located at Highway 2 and Pine Lake Road. Item 1.7 is use permit 19001A to allow for an approximate 8,400 square feet building expansion and to allow for the sale of alcohol for consumption off the premises on property generally located at 4841 North 84th Street. This is final action on this item unless appealed to the City Council within 14 days. Use permit 20013 is to allow for approximately 3,500 square feet of commercial floor area with a waiver request to adjust the side yard setback to 10 feet for parking on property generally located at 6016 South 87th Street. Under corrected resolution, item 1.9, this gives authorization to our chair, Tracy Core, to correct nunc pro tunc a clerical error in special permit 20030, which was before the Planning Commission on September 2nd, by interlineating 2030 for a temporary mobile home to be used for residential occupancy while building a house pursuant to the provisions of Article 13.025 of the Lancaster County Zoning Resolution on property located at 13500 West Van Dorn Street, legally described as follows. Lot 33 in the southwest quarter of Section 31, Township 10 North, Range 5 East, Lancaster County, Nebraska, in place of 19039 for an expanded home occupation permit to allow firearms from the residents and get a waiver to allow sales of a product not manufactured, processed, treated, or assembled on the premises of property located at 9700 Raymond Road, legally described as follows. Lot 19, irregular tract in Section 35, Township 12 North, Range 7 East, Lancaster County, Nebraska. Are there any ex parte communications to be disclosed on these items?
I don't see any.
Are there any ex parte communications that took place or additional information you learned while visiting these sites?
I don't think we have any of those either.
Is there anyone here wishing to speak on any of these consent agenda items? If so, please stand and state that item.
Okay, I don't think we have anyone that wants to talk on these things, so I'd entertain a motion.
I'd move approval of the consent agenda. Campbell.
Anyone want a second?
Second, Joy.
I would just like to take a note that I will abstain from this vote due to an appearance of a conflict of interest for use permit 132D. As in the past, the state of Nebraska does not recognize a parent as being an immediate family member, but I do, so I will not be voting. I will be abstaining on this consent agenda.
Thanks, Tom. All right, are we ready to vote? Go ahead, Jerry.
Okay, Campbell,
Yes.
Finnegan,
Yes.
Joy,
Yes.
Ryman Yost,
Yes.
Beckius,
Abstain.
Core,
Yes.
Motion carried 5-0 with one abstention.
I will now ask Jerry to call any requests for deferral received prior to the meeting.
Okay, we received a written request on behalf of the applicant for a 2-week deferral on item 1.2 on today's consent agenda, requesting a deferral to the October 14th, 2020 Planning Commission hearing. This is for comprehensive plan conformance 20014 to review as to conformance with the 2040 Lincoln Lancaster County Comprehensive Plan and proposed amendment to the Lincoln Center redevelopment plan to add the terminal building redevelopment project on property generally located at 947 O Street and 139 South 10th Street. This would be for a 2-week deferral.
I'd entertain a motion.
I'll move deferral. Beckius?
Joy. Jerry?
Okay. Campbell,
Yes.
Finnegan,
Yes.
Joy,
Yes.
Ryman Yost,
Yes.
Beckius,
Yes.
Core.
Yes.
Motion carried 6-0.
Is there
Okay.
anyone here wishing to speak on that item today? No. Okay.
Okay. We also received a written request from the applicant for agenda items 1.3A and 1.3B, which are changes zone 20029 from R3 to H3 on property generally located west of North 33rd Street and Schwar Drive, and the associated preliminary plat 20004 for a preliminary plat consisting of 2 lots on property generally located west of North 33rd and Schwar Drive. And this would be deferring these 2 items to the October 14th Planning Commission hearing.
Move to approve, Campbell.
Second, Finnegan.
Do you mean move to defer?
Yes, to defer. Thank you.
Okay. Jerry?
Okay, Campbell,
Yes.
Finnegan,
Yes.
Joy,
Yes.
Ryman Yost,
Yes.
Beckius,
Yes.
Core.
Yes.
Motion carried 6-0.
Is there anyone here wishing to speak on these 2 applications today? No. Okay. So our next item on the agenda is not scheduled until 1:30, so we will take a short break until 1:30 rolls around. Okay, it is 1:30, so we will now proceed to public hearing. If you are here to speak on text amendment 20006, testimony will be taken from individuals in the order of sign-in. The clerk will call 3 names from the sign-in sheets. When your name is called, please be prepared to come forward to testify. Before presenting your testimony, please be sure to state your name, spell your last name, state your position, support, neutral, or opposition, and give your address. If you are representing a group of individuals, I would suggest that you identify a spokesperson to provide the testimony on behalf of the group and have the group members stand to show their support for your position. If during testimony you have copies of documents or materials you would like distributed to the Planning Commission members and/or included as part of the record, please provide that information to the clerk for distribution. Each person testifying shall have 5 minutes to speak unless additional time is requested and granted. Due to the anticipated large number of people wanting to testify on text amendment 20006, please understand that we will adhere to the 5-minute limitation. The timer will go off after 4 minutes, and the clerk will indicate that you have 1 minute remaining to wrap up your testimony. Once the final minute has lapsed, the clerk will indicate that your time is up. Following public testimony, the staff applicant will then be given an opportunity to respond to the testimony and provide for rebuttal. The Planning Commission will vote immediately at the close of the public hearing unless the Commission votes to defer action or continue the public hearing. Jerry, will you call the first public hearing item, please?
Yes. Item 4.1 is text amendment 20006, amending various sections of the Lincoln Municipal Code, including section 27.67.040 to provide a definition and conditional zoning regulations for transitional living facilities that will replace the regulations for alternative to imprisonment facilities by repealing section 27.63750 to remove special permits for alternative to imprisonment facilities and repealing said various sections as hitherto existing. Staff recommendation is for approval. Are there any ex parte communications to be disclosed on these items?
I don't see any.
Okay. I would just note that I don't have a sign-in sheet, and I'm thinking that maybe, oh, okay, here it comes. We'll go ahead with staff presentation, it's fine.
Mr.
Okay.
Henriksen.
Steve Hendrickson of the Planning Department. We weren't planning a presentation as we gave you a briefing on this. Along with, we also had staff from the Nebraska Office of Courts and Probation, so have a chance to answer questions without taking up time for the public testimony. Basically, we look at this as a compromise proposal in terms of it still provides for a lot of conditions that help protect the adjacent neighborhood, but provides to allow this use within Lincoln, because people who are already being released through the court system one way or another are already residing in Lincoln, and we think actually in this particular setting it's a far favorable outcome for them and for the public versus it being in a condition where there's no review whatsoever. With that, we'll certainly be back to answer questions at the end, but if there's any questions that were pressing before we got started, we could certainly try to answer those.
I have a couple that, came in on the letters that we received.
Sure.
That I just wanted to kind of get on the record here. One letter mentioned, they wanted to know if an assisted living facility falls under the residential health care facility, and I just...
Yes.
Okay. It also talked about mapping, and there was a question as to who is going to maintain, the distance requires in the maps as to where they are located right now. Is that something the planning department will do, or?
Yes, that's something that the planning department will do, and would note the map we prepared was to try to help provide an example so that you all in the public could see with the 500 and the 1,000 and the uses that are listed, what kind of spaces might be still left for this use. Whatever the final product is that is adopted by the City Council, we will then work to further improve that map and the locations are on there. We've already had several people point out, well, what about this use? It's not in your map, or what about that use? Some of those uses are non-conforming uses. They've been a group home or an assisted living facility that's been there for decades. Others are facilities that haven't come forward and got either a review for conditional use or a special permit. And so we'll look into those as well. So certainly we think that map will probably be added to and updated over time, as well as once we get a final product, we would then get it started. But it was something that we would keep up to date as we lose or add uses.
Will that include properties that have only 3 or more, or have the permit, or will it
It
include?
would only be more than 3, because 3 or less is considered a family and is a permitted use, and so there is really no tracking. So even if you knew that House X was operated by somebody and had only 3 unrelated persons who were there because they were in Nebraska probation system, let's say, that would not be mapped. It would only be those that had more than 3.
If an operator, as it's drafted right now, the text amendment talks about the operator has to, keep their address, or not their address, I'm sorry, their contact information up to date and current. Is that one of the things that, if it's not current, there's some conditions in there that say the permit could be revoked? Would that be enough to make it be revoked?
It certainly would be one of the conditions, and failure to comply with the conditions is a possibility for it being revoked. And so I think we would try to contact somebody if the provider left and a new one moved in, and make a couple of efforts to provide them. And I suppose our last letter would say, if we don't hear back from you, we would have to take steps to actually revoke the special permit or the administrative permit, and hopefully that would be enough to get their attention, and we would get the contact information.
If there is a case where the administrative approval is revoked, does the facility need to completely cease operations, or would it just have to go down to 3 or less?
Going down to 3 or less would still be an option, because that is considered a family and is a permitted use.
Okay. Is there any other land use that we have in the current zoning code that requires an administrative permit, that like it's proposed in this?
Yes, we have a couple of uses. There are 2 different types of temporary concrete batch plants, and there is also a type of a cellular wireless cell tower permit that could also be an administrative permit, but we don't have many of them.
Okay. Does anyone else have any questions right now?
I don't think so, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. In the order of sign-in, I have Marriott Dakima, let's see, Roy Helm, and Ryan Tarnick testifying.
So who was the first one, Mary Ann?
Mariette,
Mariette. Come on forward. Sure.
that's fine.
Who's the next one on the list?
Let me see. Roy Helm, Ryan Tarnick, and Greg Newport.
Good afternoon. I'm Roy Helm. I oppose.
Can you
This-
give us your street address too, or your
Pardon me?
mailing? Can you give us your mailing address?
Oh, yes, 2750 South 13th Street here in Lincoln. I am opposed to this in its current form. I think it's lacking a great deal of language. I do support the name change from alternative to incarceration facilities to alternative living facility, because it's more appropriate for the use of it, of the properties. And I do recognize and support these facilities. That's not my issue. The issue I have is that while the planning department maintains that they're only concerned about zoning and not other conditions that may exist inside a home, as far as living conditions, et cetera, and I guess specific issues. It's not right for this to be moving forward without those issues being resolved. It's been suggested that other departments have oversight over some of the interior conditions, living conditions, and it's my understanding that's just not so. No department has come forward to take responsibility for it, and these are unique facilities. I mean, this is not like a beauty salon. It's not something of that nature. So we need to have a comprehensive, multi-departmental plan that addresses every issue and concern that has been brought up over these facilities. At the open house, there was a great deal of input received or given to the planning department, and what I saw in the amended version, our voices weren't heard. And again, we've been told that that's not the purview. So in my humble opinion, if it's not their purview, then whose is it? And how can we in good conscience approve permits when we don't know what's happening inside the homes? We don't know the living conditions. We don't know if the residents have right of appeal, if there are issues. We don't know how much they're having to pay to live in these facilities when the state is already providing compensation to the property owners. So this has the potential to be, cash cow for people who are not concerned with the conditions and the success of the residents. And to me, that is irresponsible. We're not doing them justice. We're not serving the community. All we're doing is giving people money. Another huge issue is in the issuing of permits. Under the current guidelines, as I understand it, the permits would stay with the property, and the property could be sold, transferred to another individual, and that being without any type of review or knowledge of what this other party, what their track record is, what their intent is, if they're going to be good stewards. And I know that there are people who have facilities with 3 people or less that are doing an admirable job. But we need to make sure that we don't have the bad apples taking over these properties.
1 minute.
We need to maintain control. We also need to maintain having public hearings for permitting and to allow the city council to have input and a voice. Taking the public voice away is reprehensible. We need to have input. We need to allow the city council to make changes as needed, and it's the right thing to do, and we can't have a rubber stamp process where someone checks the boxes and we hand over a permit in perpetuity. This is too serious an issue, and there are too many lives at stake, and we need this to be successful. So I thank you for your consideration, and I would request that you defer action until after the city council can come up with some regulations, or the state. Thank you.
Any questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next I have Ryan Tarnick, Greg Newport, and Shelley Stahl.
Is Ryan Tarnick next?
Okay. Greg Newport.
Good afternoon. My name is Greg Newport. I live at 1954 A Street here in Lincoln. That's Newport. I have a written statement, and most of my comments pretty much reflect what, Tracy, you've already brought up and what has already been spoken. But if you don't mind, I'll just still go ahead and still read through this, and open it up for questions if you have any. And is it okay if I take this off right now? Thank you.
We can hear you a lot better.
Well, my glasses fog up when I, thank you. First of all, we appreciate the opportunity to come and address the commission about this topic, and we hope that we will take everybody's opinions to heart, as both my wife and I have a deep love for older neighborhoods, and not only the near south, where we live, but also the Malone neighborhood, which is historically a neighborhood that I've been very tied to. I would like to start by saying that we have learned quite a bit of since the letter that I wrote, which you should all have a copy of in your file, and some of which probably deserve to be slapped down a little bit, but in terms of accuracy. But I think, all in all, I think it's been a good process for us to learn really what the true intent of this ordinance, these amendments to this ordinance are, and how they would be maintained. But I think we still have a few issues, I guess, that we'd like to bring up. I guess, first of all, the distance requirement of 1,000 feet between facilities, I haven't been able to figure out or find out from anybody where that distance came from. I mean, where's that been generated from? Nobody in planning or other people that I've talked to seem to be able to tell me where that comes from. Kansas City has an ordinance, which was in the materials that we got, that puts it up to 1,500 feet in a radius around each property. Whether it's 1,000 or 1,500, I guess I think it needs more further study, to see how it would impact, I guess, development within the neighborhoods. Not that we're after closing off all development, because I think development can be a positive thing, but I think it's more or less an issue of the frequency and the amount of density, as I pointed out in my letter. The near south neighborhood density is fairly high right now, as other older neighborhoods are, and that's strictly tied to property values and how attractive it is to develop within the older neighborhoods. But we have, we've had our share of things, I guess, integrated into the neighborhood, and I guess we would like to see it better controlled and better maintained in terms of keeping our neighborhood vital. Another issue that Tracy already addressed, I think, in your questions, I think for us, is that the accuracy of the map, and I think Steve also addressed it, that the accuracy of the map that has been given out has some flaws in it, and we've been asking for clarification on some of those issues, which I think probably has instigated Steve's comments. But having an accurate map, is critical to this process, and not only for monitoring from the planning development side, but also the neighborhood side, because a lot of responsibility is being put on the neighborhoods to help oversee and monitor, I guess, to make sure that things are being done according to the ordinance, because there is quite a bit at stake. So I think that's being worked through, and hopefully that will continue, and the accuracy of those maps will be up to speed here soon.
1 minute.
Oh, I better keep moving. The other issue that I think is paramount here to bring up is the revocation process, and it's been already discussed a little bit, but there seems to be kind of loose language in terms of the process for revocation of a permit. I would like to see, and I think people we've talked to think it makes sense to have a moratorium on the property if it goes into revocation. Maybe a moratorium of a year, so that it puts enough onus on the property owner to keep the property in compliance with the regulations, and it probably puts enough risk into their hands that they wouldn't want to see that happen. So hopefully that can be studied and further developed. Let's see here. I'm sure I left out some things, but my wife is behind me. That's probably going to add a few things, I guess, to our concerns. But I appreciate the time, and thank you for listening. And I do have a copy of these comments if you would care for a copy of it for the record.
Mr. Newport, if you wouldn't mind putting a copy in that folder that's up on the podium there.
Okay.
Thank
Right-
you.
Right in front of me here, okay. I will do
Anyone
that.
have any questions before he leaves? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I have Shelley Stahl, Kathy Wilkin, and Dan Kuba.
Good afternoon. I'll take this off so you can hear me. Yes, Greg and I live at 1954 A Street, and I have lived in the near south. My name is Shelley Stahl, and I have lived in the near south for over 30 years. And I too support transitional living facilities. I think they're enrich a neighborhood. But I'm also concerned that we pay attention to some of the issues that have already been addressed, including the spacing issue. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about the notification. I know in the section that ends C5, two little i's, that there's a notification to neighbors within 200 feet of the proposed facility, and they just get a 10-day notice. I think that this ordinance, to me, requires a lot of neighbors. They need to be watchful here of what's going on in the neighborhood, and when there are conditions that seem to be rolling out of control, they have some responsibilities to report to building and safety and the police department and things like that. I think it would be good if there could be something included that would allow notification to the neighborhood association once a permit is approved. I mean, you know, we're not asking for a public hearing. I mean, some people here are, but we're not necessarily asking for a public hearing before issuance. But I think the neighborhood should at least be notified when a facility has been approved. And then, as Greg had started to address with the revocation language, it's the last thing in the new proposed changes. And I think it could be expanded a little bit. Let's assume that facility gets approved and everything's going fine, and then later on, maybe things don't go fine. There's nothing in the ordinance that gives us any indication about how a neighbor might start a review process so that the problems could be addressed. And so I would just say, you know, what will trigger a license to be reviewed? How will the neighbors be able to have some input in that process? And then I think Greg addressed this, but I wanted to reiterate too, if there is a penalty, what do you do? If somebody has not operated this facility properly, what's going to happen? Can they just go out and form another LLC and come back in and keep operating the property? Or would there be a moratorium for maybe a year so this can settle down and we can see what can happen next? We would suggest that without some kind of penalty, I think it's possible that it would just keep rolling. So I guess that does bring up the issue is, should the permit be issued for a period of time? I think one of the gentlemen here suggested that it right now is in perpetuity. It might be worth looking at. Should it have a limit on it? I think I read in Kansas City, Missouri, they have a 2-year limit. Maybe that's too soon. Maybe it'd be more fair to an operator to say 3 or 4 years. And then it could have just a standard review, which might not be more than a reapplication process, or that could be figured out by the planning department. Anyway, thank you for considering our thoughts on this. We too want people to come into our neighborhood and succeed, and we want them to be able to contribute to our community along with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Kathy Wilkin?
No comments at this time, thank you.
Okay. And Daniel Kuba and Mark Leaker.
I have no comment at this time because we were just informed of this actually occurring in the last 24 hours, and it's directly in our neighborhood. I'm rather baffled that it's got.
Do you want to just come on up and say that? Sorry.
I've only been informed.
So just go ahead and give us your name and stuff.
Daniel Cuba, 6016 Oak Ridge Drive. I was just informed within 24 hours from several neighbors. They got a neighborhood notice that this type of alternative incarceration facility was being moved into our neighborhood. And where it's located on El Cresta, we were not informed or anything that there was an open house or that this project was even coming into the neighborhood. And this is an artery where up to twice a day, there's 50 or more. Pre-COVID, there's 50 or more children that walk to Zeman Elementary School. But however, there's so many uninformed neighbors that are currently working couldn't be here today, and they asked that I come down here and try to get some answers, and everybody seems to be a lot more prepared than I was. I was not expecting any of this. However, there's a great number of neighbors in the Colonial Hills area that look completely oblivious to this going on, and I think that maybe some public information needs to be put out there so that this just doesn't get put in place and they find out at a later date after it's already established. I don't think that's right.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going back to Marriott. Dickerman?
Marriott Dykaba from 600 Fleetwood Drive, and that's also Colonial Hills area.
Can you spell your last name for us?
Dykema.
Thank you.
And I also was here more to find out what's going on, but just in the last couple of days found out that transitional living could be put in our neighborhood, and it's zoned a single-family housing area. And it particularly affects me because last fall somebody purchased the house right next to me solely for renting. And although there's a very nice family with 3 kids in there right now, I don't foresee that as, a 10-year thing or something. So I see it as a potential place, and I would personally be terrified if I had to live next to somebody that's been imprisoned and I wasn't no oversight. I was told there would be no oversight, no permits, and I'm just going, I can't do that. And also, kids walk to school. It's like it's a family area, and I don't know. I just was shocked. And I guess that's about all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming up. Was that the last one?
I don't have anyone else left on my list. I know we do have.
We did miss one, didn't we? Okay.
Take this off. Hi, my name is Mark Leaker, Leeker. I live at 2732 South 13th Street. And I basically concur with all the speakers that have been up here regarding this issue. I do think transitional living is important and it can be successful. But there are some gray areas that haven't, been addressed yet. So for permitting, I would like to see public hearings, or at least input from the neighborhoods considered as permitting goes on. And transparency, I found out that the house next door to me was going to be one of these facilities after the fact. I had talked to the owner of the house and welcomed her to the neighborhood and her family, and she didn't mention anything about this being a transitional living facility. So it would be nice to, I know there's supposed to be some notification now, a 10-day notification for anyone living in 200 feet of the place. So I would like to see that extended to the neighborhood, and urge you to continue the moratorium at this time so that this can be studied a little bit more for the sake of the neighbors and the people who are getting out of prison, so they can be successful in their recovery. That's all I have.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Kathy Wilkin.
Thank you, Kathy Wilkin, Wilken, 1942 A Street, Lincoln. I just thought of one additional thing that has not been mentioned, so thank you for your time. I think there are 37 neighborhood associations in Lincoln. Correct me if I'm wrong. And it would benefit these neighborhood associations that are listed on the city website to be able to get a notice of these things when changes such as this are happening, especially in neighborhoods that have been spoken to, near South, et cetera, today. These have huge impacts, and specifically the Near South Neighborhood Association is very active and aware of what's happening, and this is very important that we be kept abreast of the changes that directly affect us and our neighbors. And so we support this prospect, but we want to be informed of it and have a voice in it. And I think we've heard today other people are just finding out about this and trying to speak to it, but with not enough time to properly study it. So I think that would be a great coup for the city to be able to be more in contact with the people that are listed in the neighborhood association groups, and it would benefit us all to be team players and members in making Lincoln even better. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, I know that we do have 2 individuals registered for teleconferencing.
So we're done with our in-person, no one in the back room, okay? So I'll let Channel 5 tell me who's going to be first for our video testifiers.
Okay, I have Monica Zinke, and then we'll be followed by Tina Arciaga.
Hi, Monica, can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, as they said, my name is Monica Zinke. I'm the executive director at Fresh Start, which is a transitional living facility located at 6433 Havelock Avenue here in Lincoln. And on behalf of our board of directors, we just want to say that we support this zoning for transitional living facilities and the change in name from alternative to prison because it's a more reflective of what the program is for. We do encourage the Planning Commission and City Council to look at some basic standards for programming for these programs. That's a difficult task because there's not a one-size-fits-all model for the various kinds of transitional living facilities, but we do support the zoning with some basic guidelines in place to ensure that the residents and the participants in these programs do get the support that they need and to decrease the chance of essentially profiteering. There are a lot of successful programs already in the community, already operating in the community that maybe didn't fall under this zoning. For example, Fresh Start has more than 16, so we didn't fall under this zoning. And people involved with corrections, probation, and parole are in our community or are returning to our community regardless of this zoning, and allowing supportive programs to operate in neighborhoods is a better option than them having no programs to go to while they're getting reestablished. Yes. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Calling in.
Right, I have one.
Oh, wait.
Sorry. Hi, Monica. This is Christy Joy, one of the planning commissioners. When you talk about basic standards, did you have a recommendation based on your experience?
Well, that's the challenge, and why we didn't submit a letter is because that is a challenge. For example, our program is very different from Hanu Home. They're both very quality programs that follow a very different model. So staffing levels, the amount of programming requiring for the participants would look very different for different models. But we do want there to be some kind of basic standard to make sure that the residents are getting something they need. At Fresh Start, we have 24/7 staff. Not everybody needs that amount of support and supervision. So we wouldn't want to recommend that for every program because not every program follows that model. So I don't have a specific list at this time, other than to say we encourage that it's not a one-size-fits-all model that involves a lot of programming that might be more than what the participant needs, or that might be burdensome for the program to be able to offer and afford.
Wait, sorry.
Oh, wait, I think we have some more questions for you.
Sorry, Monica, this is Cindy Ryman-Yost.
Turn on your mic.
Sorry. Hi, Monica, this is Cindy Ryman-Yost, also a member of the Planning Commission. Acknowledging that there is definitely not a one-size-fits-all, and you just mentioned that you have staff. Can you just briefly talk about the different kinds of inspections and how often they happen for your facilities, like fire, health department, or licensing? Just what are the kinds of things that you do currently have in place and how often those have to occur?
Sure. For the building permit side, we have to have a number of different inspections yearly. So the fire marshal comes yearly, there's an elevator inspection yearly, there's a boiler system inspection yearly. So there's a number of different inspections for the actual facility from the building sense. We also, because of some of our different funding sources, we also have an inspection by Lincoln Housing Authority yearly that also looks at habitability. And then it's not so.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, Monica. I know you were talking
Okay,
about.
do you need me to? You need me to repeat anything?
I think we heard about the the annual inspections for, like the fire department and the boiler and that kind of thing. So it was just when you're starting the next part.
Okay. Aside from the building part, from the programming standpoint, it's not inspections per se, but because our participants are involved with, for example, Lancaster County Community Corrections, we have those workers that stop by. We have probation officers and parole officers that stop by that also would be doing an informal check of the living situation for the participants in their program. And since they're at Fresh Start, then that in essence is a review of the Fresh Start facility. It's just not on a set schedule because it's not a permitting or a licensing issue. It's more about the participants that they're working with through their programs.
Awesome. Cindy kind of took the question. I was wondering kind of the same thing, so thank you.
Perfect, yeah.
Does anyone else have questions for Monica?
Oh, that was great.
Okay, I think we're finally ready to let you off the hook for right now.
Thanks, Monica.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we have Tina next.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, how are you guys? So I have the house at 420 South 28th Street, and I just actually am here just to listen to others, just to see if there was any concerns or any questions you may have. I do support the tax amendment for the transitional housing, and I think it's important. And I think it's important on the building side to do the commercial permits so, you know, the people in the house are safe as far as having to do sprinklers and, you know, just smoke alarms and carbon monoxide detectors. And as far as Fresh Start's concerned, I forgot her name, she was just on. We do get inspections, or I may have to have inspections through the building site. I'm not sure because I'm new to this, but the fire might come out and inspect the house as well. We also get visits through drug court, community corrections, and probation officers as well. So they do go inside the house with visits just to kind of check out the living conditions. But with that being said, I don't have much more to add unless you have any questions.
Tina, how do you feel about the conditions that are on the proposed text amendment? Do you feel okay as a provider that you'd be able to follow those? And is anything extraordinary?
My only concern is that like this is going through the planning department, and I've spoke with Steve about this too. You know, the new person just going through this process, you know, you go through the planning department and then you go to the actual building side and you're like, a lot of people don't know that you have to put sprinklers in or you have to do all this extra stuff. And it's really expensive to do this kind of work. And so my concern was if it's maxed out at 6, I just was hoping it wouldn't have to be a commercial permit, if you will. So we wouldn't have to do so much of that extra cost as far as, you know, I have a historical home. And so when I put fire sprinklers in, it kind of changes the whole design of the house, if you will. So I just think that people are going to maybe be detoured because it costs a lot of money to do the building side commercial permit, if you will. So that's what's bothering me.
Thanks for sharing. Any other questions for Tina? Okay, thanks for calling in, Tina.
Yep, thank you.
Okay, we didn't have any more in-person testifiers. Okay, so,
I would move that we close the public hearing.
I think we need to have staff.
Oh, yeah,
Applicant
sorry.
rebuttal. I know you're anxious,
Try
but
to
geez.
cut you off, Steve.
That's all right.
Okay, questions for Mr. Hendrickson?
Sure.
Go for it.
Steve, could you please describe what actions a neighborhood resident would take if they wanted to initiate a review of the permit?
Sure, it'd be similar to what is done today. Sometimes people call the planning department and they'll say, this special permit or this use permit was approved and I don't think they're doing X, Y, and Z as was shown in the conditions. And so we might first talk with them and say, yeah, it looks like you might have a point here. Ultimately, building and safety is our enforcement agency, and so typically the remark might then go to our complaint to building and safety, who then goes out and inspects and sends a letter to the person. So sometimes people call building and safety directly, sometimes our office. Either way, it would work out fine.
Steve, I'm going to piggyback on that real quick. Could they use like the uplink or the website application to trigger a review as well?
Yeah, we get comments online through just our general plan that sends things over as well.
Okay.
I think Commissioner Finnegan, did you have a follow-up to that?
No, not to follow up to this. I have I think I do. So if you could just review, because one of the people on the Zoom, Tina, talked about the commercial permit now with building and safety. If you could just do a quick synopsis of next steps after it gets through the zoning portion, if you could just summarize that from a building standpoint.
And actually, for all of these kind of applications, whether it's daycare or anything else, we try to say that there's actually both of your first steps, because particularly sometimes people discover the requirements of the building code make it too expensive. So why turn in an application to us when you only discover it's too expensive? So we actually encourage people to look at both those things at the same time. So in this case, if they got an administrative permit approval from us, they would still, having more than 3 unrelated persons in the house, it would still be group living. It falls into a different part in the building code. And so they would still need to get their building permit, occupancy permit, and get approval of whatever changes, fire exits, whatever it would be required to have that use as well.
So just really quick, so if it's more than 3, group living, is there another threshold after that? What's the next threshold?
Well, on the building code side, that's an excellent question, and I'm not sure exactly what their range is.
Okay.
I'm assuming there must be some point where you fall into the next category, but mostly we've had people talking to us about between 3 and 16, and that does often then kick off a different category in the building code.
Okay.
Steve, does that, is that building and safety inspection for the fire equipment and the whatever is required, is that checked before they officially can get their final approval?
No, we could approve the administrative permit that says this site meets all of the conditions, but you can't move in until you've got your final sign off and your building permit and everything with building and safety. So you'd still have to make those changes with them. Both steps would be required. We're just checking off that you've met the spacing requirement, whatever the conditions are that are approved by the city council. We're just checking off that you meet those conditions.
Okay.
Go ahead, Christy. Oh, sorry.
Well, no, go ahead. I lost my train of thought
Oh,
here.
no.
No. A lot of people came up, or the people who came up, mentioned no notification to neighborhood association. Would that take any big effort, or do we notify?
Good question. That was one of the things I was going to mention under comments, was there's a section 2781050 that is a notice about public hearings, and that's where we have our standard 200-foot notification. It's larger in the county. We don't actually have a requirement on any of our applications that we notify neighborhoods, but we do.
You do.
And so we would notify neighborhood associations here on this type of an administrative permit the same way we do all these other kinds of applications. I'll even note, sometimes administrative amendments, that it might be the case. But by and large, all these other things we're not required to, but that's been standard practice to notify the neighborhood associations, and we do that in this case. I think that's a good suggestion.
Steve, I just want to clarify, are you doing that before or after or both?
Well, in the case of all of our other applications, it's before. In this case, as it's proposed, the notification is afterwards, that the permit has met the conditions and the permit was granted on the site. We think that's more appropriate because in this particular circumstance, if it's approved this manner, there really isn't a subjective, oh, well, depending on this or that, we might approve it. It's if it meets these conditions, and the conditions are ones that are objective, there isn't really any additional information that we were looking for. So we think it's more important to notify somebody afterwards this use has been approved.
Will you send that notification to just the neighborhood where the property is located, or will you send it to the whole neighborhood association list, or how do you envision that happening?
Typically, it would be the neighborhood association that the property's within. Sometimes we get them where they're on a 9th Street and one's on one side and one's on the other, so we notify both neighborhood associations.
Thank you.
But the letter goes to whoever's chairing the neighborhood association and not to each individual member.
Correct. We have a list, and we ask neighborhood associations to keep that list up. Typically, it's a president or something. Some have post office boxes, and anymore we're using just mostly a lot of emails and things on that as well. Particularly when of this text amendment itself, we notified a lot of neighborhood associations, our typical mailing list. We've had a mailing list kept up for people who are just interested in this topic, so we've been emailing them as well to say, here's the hearing process.
Christy.
Mine's a new topic. Is everybody else done with this? Okay. It was mentioned to have a permit with a time limit or a term limit, and then also looking at it from a standpoint of a renewal process, yearly, 5 years, those types of things. How has the planning department thought about that?
Well, again, we look at this as a land use application item. And so if you've met all the conditions, the spacing and things, there really isn't a purpose in terms of the land use zoning conditions to have it expire after 5 years or a review, because once your dot goes on the map and it's now cast off a 1,000-foot buffer around it, there really wouldn't be a need to further review that again a few years down the road. If there is some complaint about the house is starting to fall apart, well, that's a complaint process we have with any house. You can complain to building and safety, is it failing to meet the building code? Or if it's a house where there's always these noise complaints and parties and you think there's drug use and things, well, that's something you should complain to the police department like you would any other house as well. So that's why we didn't think it was this, the tool here being a land use tool, zoning, we didn't think it was appropriate to have any kind of annual renewal or something like that with the zoning part of it.
Is there any other land use items that we have in our city and county that does require a time limit or a
Yes.
review?
The one that I know of is, well, there'd be two different types. One would be soil extraction, because often that is tied to a project. And so you'll see that often it just has a 3-year time limit for that, though some people have then come back in and applied again. And the other one would actually be one of our other administrative permits that is for like a temporary concrete plant. That's often tied to a project like the interstate widening. And it says once the interstate widening is done, your temporary concrete batch plant needs to go away. It's specifically approved as temporary, so it does have a time limit that it ends. But in this case, this is not necessarily meant to be a temporary. As Tina Arciaga mentioned, you might spend $15,000 to $25,000 on a upgrade of the house to meet all of the conditions. And if you're only going to be allowed to be there for 2 years and you don't know if it can be much beyond that, you'd be very hesitant to expend that kind of money when it's only good for 2 years. And this isn't something we've seen with other ones. We don't have a alcohol special permit, for instance, that is only good for 2 years or 4 years. We have lots of other special permits, childcare, those type of things, where they're certainly concerned about the childcare operator. You want to make sure you have good childcare operators, but our part of the process doesn't say, well, every 2 years you're going to check on the operator. There's a different process for the licensing of the childcare center.
Steve, I'm going to hold us on this for just a second. Can you explain why on the soil excavation, why we have them renew after 3 years? Is it kind of like the temporary concrete? Is it?
Yeah, I mean, typically it is been tied to projects in the area. I think it's also been somewhat, you're looking at the impact on the adjacent road system, and so the county engineer had wanted an opportunity to say, well, hold it, I thought this was going to be minimal impact, but it's really been tearing up the roads. And that is also one I will say, has been kind of a best practice with that type of a use. So it is a little unique, and it's often we're not viewing that as a permanent use either. We're not trying to have 50-year soil mining areas. Typically, they often come and go quickly as well.
You don't want them digging to China?
It'd be a long way to haul it.
Through the center. One other thing, so when you're talking about like other things that are approved, other uses that are approved through special permits, like the child care, or that's one that I remember you mentioned. Does that permit go with the land ownership, or does that cease with?
Nope. All of the special permits, use permits, run with the site, regardless of who the property owner is or regardless of who the operator is.
So someone could buy the daycare and?
Correct. They could buy the restaurant, they could buy the office building, and so you want that zoning to have some permanency so that it can continue with the land.
Thank you. Sorry, Jerry. Your turn. Jerry. Dean.
Dean, sorry.
It makes no sense to be Dean and him, yeah, I should be Jerry, I guess. Steve, Mr. Newport wanted to know how the 1,000 feet was decided. Can you give us just a quick
Sure. No, I had written down, that was one of the things to address as well. It is a subjective number that we came up with based on looking at all of the different communities, looking at our own community, looking at our other uses and the spacing requirements they have. I mean, we have a much larger 2,640 feet spacing for group homes, but they're only one group home to another group home. So this is spacing to a lot of other group living uses. And so we were trying to find that balance that if it was 2,640 to these 5 or 6 other uses, there would be very few spots left in town for this use. Likewise, on the other side, if we only had 100-foot spacing, it'd allow a lot more land, but yet the concern was we don't want to have a clustering of these in any one neighborhood. And so we thought 100 feet, that's not really very much. So we started looking at the spacing requirements and arrived at a even number, 1,000 feet, as something that tried to have that balance in between the two. We're proposing a lesser number, 500 feet, in the R5 to R8, because those are a much more intensive, higher density area. So the idea there was, just like group homes, which have a lesser spacing in the higher density district, we would have a lesser spacing for these, but again, it would be to all these other uses.
I have a couple of questions, but I think they're for someone from the city attorney's office, so
Okay.
you're off the hook.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to hit here? Otherwise, I'm sure Abby or Tim C. would love to come in and address some of the other questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Steve, we've heard reference again to a potential user in the Colonial Hills neighborhood. Can you address that issue, as we had talked about that issue previously at the open house as well?
Sure, and that was a use that was allowed as a group home. It had been found by the city building safety that it had met the appropriate spacing conditions, and so it is planning to go in and start operating. And I think they've already been going through with building safety to make sure that they could have the building code done. And they could find my notes as to who the actual operator was, but that was not this type of facility. That was not necessarily the clientele they were looking to serve.
Sure. And just for reference, can you detail the difference between a group home and a transitional living facility?
Sure, and that is something that is confusing to the general public, and I can understand, because a group home, there can be two basic types. It can be a group home that is serving as a foster home, so to speak. You're caring for children whose parents can't care for them in a home-like setting. So that's one type of group home, typically 4 up to 16 kids. The other type is that they are there receiving some type of therapy or counseling on site for people who are going in recovery of some type of an addiction. They're no longer actively using some illegal substance, but they are now in recovery and they're receiving the therapy or counseling on site. And can get a little confusing in that if that's the primary thing you're doing, is providing the therapy and counseling, some of the people you're providing therapy and counseling for could also be coming out of probation, parole, or through the courts. So it's not a mutually exclusive. You can't say, oh, hold it, you've been in the courts, so you can't be in our group home. You could be in the group home. This new use is one where primarily what you're doing is serving people who are out of the court system. That's the main focus. They too may also be recovering from alcohol addiction or drug addiction, and what we've heard from the providers is that's often quite the case, is that some type of substance abuse problem was part of what led them to getting into the correction system to begin with.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Steve right now?
And I can jump back up.
Okay.
Abby is now here in quest for your questions.
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon, Abby Luttrell from the Law Department.
Well, I have several questions for you. Who decides what kind of programming goes into one of the transitional living facilities? Is it planning, is it city council, or is it the state?
So,
or the county, I guess, yeah.
What you're considering right now is a land use proposal in the zoning code, which addresses the activity, describing generally what the activity is, and whether that's appropriate for this piece of land. And that's kind of the discussion we have in planning. With these programs, the proposal, the definition that is proposed here requires that they be affiliated with an alternatives to incarceration or transitional living program, which could be at the state level, could be at the federal level, could be at the county level, could be tribal, and I guess plausibly could even be international. And they will set the programming requirements for their own programs. So I think they'll vary. Our definition does require that they be affiliated with one of them, but we're not using the zoning code to dictate what the programming should be. Does that answer your question?
It does,
Okay.
it does.
That's a good.
And then the other, and you may not be able to answer this, but it's along the same line, the question of dollars. Who decides how much is being paid? It's not a land use, so is it like the programming?
Yes, the program, the relationship, we have some familiarity with what state probation is doing, and they have different levels and they have a pay scale. I would submit to you that as a matter of zoning, that's not really relevant. Just like someone mentioned a hair salon going into the neighborhood. There may be a permit associated with it, but part of your consideration will not be how much they charge for a haircut or how much the landlord is charging for booth space.
It's also my understanding, and I may be off, that the people going into transitional living that we're talking about aren't court ordered necessarily in there. They could just move in somewhere, but if they need support, they come to a transitional living. Is that correct, or is that a misstatement, or?
Again, I think it will vary from program to program. I think what we've been briefed on is that what these places provide, the service really is having a roof over your head. And this is, you know, people who are either leaving a correctional facility or are taking steps to avoid a correctional facility. A lot of times the stability to help them reach their goals isn't even necessarily the programming, it's just having a safe and sober place to go at night. So.
But they could, in some cases, just move in if they had the resources to any house in Lincoln. Is that right? As an individual?
Oh, people who would otherwise qualify for this program, yes, they could live anywhere in the community and here.
Abby, I have a question. A lot of our comments have been, you know, we would like to extend the moratorium, or, you know, we'd like more time. Can you kind of address why we're on this timeline, or why we can't extend the moratorium, I guess?
Well, the Planning Commission can't extend the moratorium because it is set by ordinance, and only the City Council can pass ordinances. I think maybe the most straightforward way to look at it is that the City Planning Department's role here is to advise the City Council on an ordinance, on the proposal that's before you. There isn't another moratorium before you. The one that's in place now didn't go through you, so I don't know that you're being asked to provide any advice on that.
Now, there was also questions related to a moratorium in a different way, whereas if, you know, they lost their administrative permit, maybe one of the conditions could be, you know, they have to cease operations for a year, that kind of thing. Could a condition like that be put into place on a permit like this?
I did hear that proposed. I would say that would be very unusual. I can't think of any other circumstance that the Planning Commission would impose that requirement. It could also affect I don't want to say value, but the condition of the site. So say someone had their permit pulled, they have a new provider moves in because there's a sprinkler system there or something who wants to operate it, then they would be bound, I would think, by that limitation as well, because as a land use issue, this is attached to the land, not attached to the person on the land. So when that person moved on, it would still be a condition of the land.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions for city staff?
No, ma'am.
Okay.
Now I move we close the public hearing.
Second, Becky is.
Jerry?
Okay, Campbell,
Yes.
Finnegan,
Yes.
Joy,
Yes.
Ryman Yost,
Yes.
Beckius.
Yes.
Core.
Yes.
Motion carried 6-0.
I would then move to approve text amendment 20006.
Second, Becky is.
Discussion.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
A lot of the testimony that we've heard today, as many of you have asked the questions, and I appreciate getting committed to that the answers I had in my head were on the right track. And that is that we are a body that has to deal with the land use and the zoning. And a lot of the ideas have been brought forward. I don't disagree with, but I think that's up to the city council to add any parameters that's out of our purview. And so at least the planning department has put together a pretty darn good text amendment here that does answer a lot of the questions that we've heard on the previous application that we dealt with. Is there some fine tuning? Absolutely. And I think that as Steve indicated, that they do send it to the president of the homeowners association. I think that wording could be put in as a requirement just to make sure, because they're doing it, but they aren't required to do it. And so I think if that was added, it would make sure that that is continued through future planning directors and planning staff members. I also think that there's some of the other things that were brought up that the council may want to look at adding. But at this point in time, the basic text amendment that has been brought forward is pretty sound. So I will be supporting it.
I would agree with Commissioner Campbell in his thoughts. As we've talked as a commission for these last few months regarding this issue, a lot of our commissioners have brought up the human issue involved in all of this, and I just want to speak to that quickly because I don't have much to add beyond Commissioner Campbell's remarks regarding the ordinance itself. But I think it's also it's important to remember that people, as they're leaving jail or prison, they re-enter our society frequently. Although that's something we may not stop and think about very often. They integrate back into our community and they take up residence in our neighborhoods. And most of the time, that's not a problem. That happens all the time. And I think that it's something really important for us to keep in mind, that this happens frequently. And also the transitional living facilities as they're proposed today do not replace the services that these folks get from corrections or probation or parole that are in addition to the requirements of the transitional living facilities. So I don't think that we're looking at a change in the oversight of these individuals as they re-enter society, and I think that's an important point for people to remember. In terms of the conditional permitting, I think that is probably the best way for us to ensure consistency and a fair application in our city, so that we don't have one rule for one neighborhood and one rule for another neighborhood, depending on if a neighborhood decides to turn out or not. And then I do agree, as noted in the report from planning, that transitional living may impose additional burdens on a neighborhood due to an increase in density and parking. So I do think that it is appropriate to have a spacing distance between these facilities in neighborhoods. The one item that I would bring to the Commission's attention, and I mentioned it before and I'll mention it again here today, is throughout the throughout this process, our previous hearings on other permits, and then the open house, and today's hearing, I really have not heard anyone in our community say anything about needing neighborhood design standards outside of the 1950 city limits as a part of this proposal. It's in here to impose neighborhood design standards regardless of where a facility is built, but I actually haven't heard anyone in our community at all mention that. I really don't think it's very important. You know, and the neighborhood design standards actually, as they're written today, really could make a new facility in a new neighborhood stand out a little bit. You know, for example, the neighborhood design standards limit your garage doors to 2 stalls. In most of today's neighborhoods, it's a 3-stall situation, if not a 4 now. That garage, there's a limit on the length of the principal street facade of how much a garage could be, whether or not your garage could be in front of your house or behind it, the width of your driveway. There's a lot of design standards that are actually made really well for existing neighborhoods that really don't apply to new neighborhoods. And so I would like to make a motion to remove the neighborhood design standards from this larger proposal, because I'm not sure it really makes sense as written. And I'm not sure anyone in our community sees that as a needed action. So I will make a motion to remove 26.62.050 section C number 3 of the proposed change that states, quote, construction of new principal residences in the R1 through R8 zoning districts shall meet the neighborhood design standards regardless of the facility location.
I would second that.
I'm not going to support that part because I think that people are more concerned about the topic at hand, which is just the transitional living facility itself, and so they haven't really considered that portion. So I don't think that just because they haven't talked about it or mentioned it, that it's not important to them. So I won't support that amendment.
The reason I will second it for discussion, if nothing else, is the fact that you've got, for example, we have traditional neighborhood development, and we have codes that were written for that exist nowhere else in the city, and they are actually city codes that are set up that way. So I think that applying the design standards, whether it's a neighborhood that's from 1950s, like let's say Eastridge is, and that was built, and all the different neighborhoods that you could think of around our city have some great differences in them. And so the design codes, I think, could be a stumbling block to bringing some of those. Do I think a house should blend in with the other homes in the area? Absolutely.
And I think, I could be wrong, but I think that that's how they are written. They're written so that it has to blend in with the existing facades. So for example, in some parts of Lincoln, a lot of the houses, especially in the older neighborhoods, have front porches or that kind of thing. So it has to, you know, have some kind of front porch. You know, if you're in a neighborhood that is not the norm, then that is not required. So I think if you're in a neighborhood where, you know, you have 3 or 4 garage stalls, I guess that's the norm and that's what it would look like. But I would have to seek clarification on that, so.
No, Commissioner, I believe you're correct. And the only thing that I would add to that is I don't know that it serves anyone a whole heck of a lot to require an applicant to go through that process when they're building in a new neighborhood that may have
Sure.
covenants.
I think it's important because we don't want someone coming in and building something new that looks like an institution instead of a home. And, you know, when they decommission, then it needs to look like a home.
Well, I would imagine that most new residences would be in a neighborhood that have restrictive covenants that would prevent such act.
That was what I was gonna ask. Would, if they were building in a neighborhood, would those design standards just by?
There's kind of a gap from my understanding. You've got new development where they're probably gonna have covenants, but you've also got neighborhoods that were probably developed. They might have had covenants when they started, but now that time frame has run out, or they don't have an existing homeowners association anymore. So you've got kind of this group that's in the middle between the 1950s and then, you know, new construction that, you know, they could be really left in the lurch there.
What about even older homes, like
From the 20s and,
go back to our home, you know?
Yeah.
I've got
like
one of those.
1901.
And those homes would be covered under the current neighborhood design standards.
If they're within the city limits.
So they would already be
If
covered.
any,
As of
yep,
1950.
any neighborhood that is within the city limits as determined by the city limits in 1950 already has to apply the neighborhood design standards when it comes to new construction or rehabilitation.
So you two are seeing this as a duplication, basically. It doesn't need to be.
What it is another requirement for an operator to meet in a new neighborhood.
New neighborhood.
It's another hoop to jump through.
I see it as protection for those neighborhoods that are kind of in between, you know, that middle where, you know, they don't have, you know, the covenants aren't active anymore, the HOA isn't active anymore. They could kind of be in the middle there and not have any protection for that kind of thing.
Tracy, if that's the case, I doubt that they have any covenants of any type, or, you know, there wouldn't be anything to compare it against in those cases.
Right, so it wouldn't be a duplication of efforts.
And it's also important to keep in mind that I believe, as we noted last time, that this would be the first time that the city of Lincoln would require the application of neighborhood design standards outside of the 1950 city limit. This is a new thing. We are adding requirements to residential buildings that we've not seen before. This is a small step, and it may seem inconsequential because the actual point or the actual outcome is probably that most people will not build a new facility to do transitional living facilities. But this is actually an important item to note because we're applying standards that have never been applied outside of the 1950s city limit before.
And that's exactly why I'll support it. Not exactly,
And
but
I
that's a
understand-
very important
And I understand
part.
why Commissioner Core would support it, because I think that there are individuals, not saying that Commissioner Core is one of them, that would like residential neighborhood design standards throughout the city of Lincoln. And I think that this is a step toward that. And what that is a step toward making housing in Lincoln cost more.
I don't think that design standards necessarily have to equal more cost. This would just be like the pitch of the roof. Do you have some glass on the front so you don't just have a blank wall? Do you have a front door facing the street? I mean, those are pretty basic things that you're gonna have anyway. Hopefully, I mean.
But why do we need to require someone to jump through those hoops?
Because once again, we have those
I think
people
that
that
we
are in
should
the
just go ahead and
middle.
vote, because I don't know that we're
Sure, no, that's
moving
fine.
forward.
Does anyone have any further discussion overall? Do you want to just vote on the amendment, or how do you?
We can vote on the amendment and then go back to the general task at hand.
Did someone, Dick, you seconded that, didn't you?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
So Jerry, do you want to call the amendment?
Sure. The motion to amend to remove section C3 from section 26.62.050 of the LMC, which was moved by Beckius and seconded by Campbell,
Yep.
relating to neighborhood design standards. Okay, Campbell?
Yes.
Finnegan?
I'm going to have to rely on my fellow commissioners who understand this more than I, and I will vote yes.
Okay, Joy?
No.
Ryman Yost?
No.
Beckius?
Yes.
Core?
No.
Motion failed for lack of, it's a 3-3 vote, majority vote.
Yep.
Now, back to discussion on the original motion.
And I do appreciate all of our commissioners' opinions there, so thank you for that. One thing that you mentioned maybe, Dick, or was it Tom, that talked about having it as a requirement for them to notify a neighborhood? Do we want to have that as an amendment? Do we need further discussion about that?
I didn't know if that was our purview or the council's.
That's what I'm asking that question.
I thought Steve said they did.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, functionally, I think Steve said that planning does.
Uh-huh.
And also, generally speaking, if one person moves into an apartment, we don't notify everyone that that's occurred. So.
Perfect, okay. That, I just wanted to bring that
I
up.
think
one more
the
time.
city has always, well, I shouldn't say always, has been pretty good about recognizing the important relationship of neighborhoods within
I
our
think so,
city.
yeah.
And so planning does a good job of trying to keep neighborhoods in the loop.
I agree. I 100% agree. Okay. I think that was all I had.
I'm just going to say, I think this has been clearly it's been a difficult issue with a lot of discussion, and I think that universally people, I mean, we have not had people, for the most part, testify that they're opposed to the concept. So I do feel like, you know, most people are supportive and understand the need for quality services and transitional living to support successful reentry and to help reduce the rates of recidivism, which are traditionally incredibly high. So I think the concept is good. I appreciate all of the work that planning has done in putting together these guidelines for the land use, which is the specific purview of the Planning Commission. I appreciate understanding a little bit more about why the 1,000-foot rule was in place, the notifications and some of those things. And then I would just like to state again, as Monica Zinke stated in her testimony, their concerns about the potential for profiteering, and that there should probably be, and it's outside of Planning Commission, but there probably should be ongoing communication for people who are concerned about this issue with their state senator or with their city council or county board members, looking at the interim study, looking at other kinds of inspections with the health department, building and safety, or the contracting providers to ensure the safety and success of the participants in these programs. Based on all of that, I will be voting to support this text amendment.
I will also support it, and I would add programming to something that they need to discuss further with the appropriate entity.
I don't really have much to add. I think that all of you have done a great job talking about the issues that are in front of us. I think that from a human side, there are a lot of challenges to everything we deal with in our society. But at that note, from a land planning standpoint, I think our city and staff have done a great job, and I will be supporting.
I agree with a lot of the things that my fellow commissioners have said today. One thing that hasn't been touched on much is I recognize there's concerns for the internal living environment. And normally, through my work with the neighborhoods, you know, a lot of times we'll hear complaints based on this, that, or the other thing. when they're investigating, they can't go inside the building and safety inspectors unless they're invited. And so that puts us at a disadvantage sometimes, and we've run into problems with that. But when I look at this from a planning standpoint, we'll approve things like sororities or fraternities, and we don't get to see the inside of how they are living either. And, you know, they might be very messy too, or, you know, they might have problems. Now, granted, they do have, you know, a house mother or something there to kind of keep an eye on things. So I understand that that's a concern from the human perspective. And that's why I think, you know, like we need some oversight here, you know. Hopefully if, you know, someone was in investigating or inspecting, I should say, the furnace, and they saw something questionable going on, that would get reported to the proper authorities. So I'm banking on that for this one. But we do have to approach this, you know, from a land use. I do appreciate and agree with some of your concerns about these other issues, but unfortunately, we're not the body for that. That's, you know, state government or city council or other people. And I encourage you guys to keep your conversations going and addressing them to those appropriate individuals. So I will support this. I appreciate the work that planning has done. I know it was kind of under the gun, and we didn't have much time, but they got it done and got as much input as they could. So thank you. Jerry?
Okay, this is for the approval of text amendment 20006. Campbell.
Yes.
Finnegan.
Yes.
Joy.
Yes.
Ryman Yost.
Yes.
Beckius.
Yes.
Core.
Yes.
Motion carried 6-0.
For anyone wishing to speak on an item not on the agenda, now is the time. Okay, I'd call for a motion.
Move to adjourn, Beckius.
Second, Joy.
Jerry?
Campbell.
Yes.
Finnegan.
Yes.
Joy.
Yes.
Ryman Yost.
Yes.
Beckius.
Yes.
Core.
Yes.
Motion carried 6-0.
We are adjourned. Thank you.